I'll call this meeting to order. It's the regularly scheduled meeting of the Transportation and Public Works Committee, this day, July 10th, 2018. I'm Councilmember Reich. I chair the committee, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Council President Bender, Fletcher, and Gordon. We are a quorum, and we'll proceed with today's agenda, of which we have 14 items. We have a combination of public hearing, discussion, and consent. I'll go through the consent items. Any committee member can pull in for further consideration. Item 4 is the first item on consent, and that's a contract with Tool Design Group for Vision Zero Action Plan. Item 5 is the contract amendment with Jurgen Construction Company for Nicollet Mall Art Restoration. Item 6 is the temporary occupancy permit agreement with Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway for a water main repair. Item 7 is the grant from Hennepin County for public recycling containers. Item 8 is the Metro Blue Line Extension Light Rail Transit Project Master Funding Agreement. Series of actions there. Item 9 is the acquisition of land from Hennepin County for a stormwater holding pond. The location of that is at 1230 New Brighton Boulevard. Item 10 is the Hennepin Avenue South. That project goes from Lake Street to West 36th Street reconstruction project. And this is authorizing negotiation with private owners for easements and additional right-of-way if necessary for the project. Item 11 is the 10th Avenue Southeast River Bridge project, layout approval and easements. Item 12 is the bid for installation of large diameter cured in place pipe. Does the committee member wish to pull an item for further discussion? See none, I will move all items as submitted on consent. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to note the importance of item number 4. Just comment really briefly. This is a contract to take the next steps on our Vision Zero action plan. And I really appreciate your leadership, Mr. Chair, and staff's in this is a commitment from our city to eliminate all deaths that happen in our roadway. We just had another vehicle death in a crash between a bicyclist who was 73 years old, just a few blocks from his house, hit by a car and killed. And it's a reminder of the importance of making sure that our streets are designed for the safety of all users. And I'm really excited about the progress that we've made so far, and that this will take it to the next level of giving us clear action steps for making sure that our streets are safer and that we're moving toward the goal of eliminating all deaths in our roadways. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments and again highlighting the initiative that we're taking, and great credit goes to our department leadership because this is not just going to be a public works endeavor, it's going to be a multi-department endeavor which creates a lot of opportunity but also additional challenge, and so we're taking that head on. So thank you for highlighting that, President Bender. Any other further discussion items? No, see none. I will submit approval for all consent items as submitted. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting nay. That carries. We will now go to the public hearing section of our agenda, starting with item 1. Good morning, Director Hutchinson.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. We have a full house of many agenda items today, the first of which is resolution adopting and levying the assessments associated with snow removal from sidewalks from this past winter. Mike Kennedy, the Director of Transportation Maintenance and Repair, will be presenting.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Mike Kennedy, Director of Transportation Maintenance and Repair for Public Works. We're here for the public hearing for snow and ice removal assessments from public sidewalks. Each winter season, Public Works enforces the city sidewalk shoveling ordinance. For properties in violation of this ordinance, Public Works sends a notice to the property owner, and if the property remains in violation of the ordinance, Public Works hires a private contractor to remove the snow and ice on the sidewalk in front of the property. All property owners receive a bill for the completed work. If the owner does not pay the bill, the cost of the work will be listed on the assessment roll and assessed to the property taxes as a special assessment on January 1 of the next year. If the property owner wishes to contest the cost of the work, they have the opportunity to appeal at an administrative hearing. If the property owner is satisfied with the determination of the administrative hearing officer, no further action is necessary. If the property owner wishes to contest that, they may choose to appeal at a public hearing today before the Transportation and Public Works Committee of the City Council, and if that appeal is denied by the committee, they may then appeal to the district court. Their appearance here today or submitting a complaint preserves their right to go to district court. That appeal must be made within 30 days of the adoption of the assessment. The properties on the list to be assessed that you have are dated June 13, 2018, and is on file with the City Engineer's Special Assessment Office, had the snow and ice removal work done by the city during 2017-2018 winter season. were sent a bill for the cost of the removal work and were notified that a special assessment for the removal charge plus interest would be added to the real estate taxes if the charges were not paid through the billing process. The amount to be assessed as special assessment principal is the cost of the removal work. The total principal amount of the proposed assessment on the list of properties to be assessed is $123,651. This assessment would be collected in their entirety on the 2019 real estate taxes with an interest rate of 3.6%. So our recommendation today is passage of a resolution adopting and levying the assessments and adopting the assessment roll for sidewalk, snow, and ice removal charges for the 2017-2018 winter season on the list of properties dated June 13, 2018. As my presentation, we have folks from the sidewalk staff here if you have any questions. I'm not positive that other people have signed in, but we'll be here to answer questions if needed.
Thank you. Any questions for the staff presentation? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing for item number 1, snow and ice removal from public sidewalks. Anyone signed in? No one signed in. Does anyone wish to come forward? Anyone wish to come forward and give testimony? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and I will move the item before us. I note that we have several letters I've gotten from different constituents and I will be reviewing them, but I'll move the item, and if there's any sort of discrepancy that can be accommodated between now and council, that can be worked through. But as of now, I'm going to move the item as submitted by staff. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. Thank you. And we now can move to item 2. Mr. Hutchinson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm going to introduce Deborah Jacobs with Transportation Engineering Design, the project manager for 28th Avenue street reconstruction. This is the project approval, assessment, and areaway abandonment public hearing for this project.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, committee members. I'm Deborah Jacobs, as Robin Hutchinson pointed out. We've got a small project in 20th Avenue South. The pavement has pretty much been there since it was developed in the late 50s, early 60s. The pavement condition index is down to 7 on a scale of 100. So we feel that it's necessary to actually do this work. Most of it is within MnDOT right-of-way. Some of it is in residential neighborhood. Since this report was written, the Metropolitan Airports Commission, which owns property along the residential portion, has volunteered to pay an assessment equivalent to the residential rate for their properties within this area. If you've got any further questions, please let me know.
Any questions per the presentation from staff? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing. Anyone signed in? No one signed in. Anyone wish to come forward? Anyone wish to come forward and give comment? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and note that not only is this an important stretch with a very much needed road repair, but it connects to a beloved dog park, and all the more important how our streets connect to our public amenities. So with that, I will move the item before us as submitted. All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries. And now we can move to the final public hearing, item 3, lower power vehicle ordinance. Director Hutchinson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, this third public hearing is around the introduction of a low power vehicle ordinance. As you know, Public Works has been working diligently to set up a framework for your consideration to embrace new mobility options in our city that both welcome the opportunity to provide choice as well as organize this new mobility within our right-of-way. John Wirchus has additional information and detail on this particular ordinance, and I'll introduce John now.
Good morning, Mr. Wirchus.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and council members. John Wirchus, Director of Traffic and Parking Services. So today we have an ordinance introduction for you. Current status of the scooter sharing industry, maybe a little background here to start off. Shared operations of motorized foot scooters gained notoriety in the late 2017 and early 2018 with launches in San Francisco, Santa Monica, as well as DC. Since those initial launches, the industry has seen significant investment, which has increased the number of operators and greatly increased the number of scooters and cities, such as Denver and Milwaukee, in which they are deployed. Similar to bike sharing, these scooter operators have often deployed scooters independently, resulting in significant disruption and backlash. This disruption included improper riding and parking of scooters in areas which impede and endanger pedestrians. as well as the damage and or vandalism to scooters and on public and private property. As a result, cities have often taken a reactive approach, in some cases resulting in the need to impound scooters or levy significant fines to cease or exercise control of these operations. While news of these scooter sharing operations has often associated with negative disruption, mentioned previously, there are potential impacts, positive impacts, that they're relative to their increased popularity. The use of shared scooters has the potential to be impactful to the shared mobility landscape, providing another alternative to personal vehicle use. With the proposed ordinance, the city intends to take a proactive approach to both welcome the new mobility option as well as regulate the operation and sharing of motorized scooters, ensuring that there is proper time to better understand and evaluate shared scooter operations as the industry continues to mature. This ordinance will allow the city time to chart a path forward for the potential introduction of these operations by requiring an agreement to operate shared scooters on city-controlled right-of-way. Any such agreement will ensure public safety and welfare with the potential benefit of mode shift associated with this scooter share operations. So turning to the ordinance itself, like bicycles, current state laws define and address how scooters, low-powered vehicles in this case, which includes motorized scooters, will be regulated and operated. Our new city proposed ordinance is intended to specifically define and regulate parking operations, sales from the public right-of-way, and the sharing of one type of low-powered vehicle, specifically motorized foot scooters. The ordinance is intended to allow for future flexibility in the types of vehicles specifically defined by the ordinance, should the need arise to regulate another type of low-powered vehicle. So in summary, Public Works is proposing this amendment to Title 18, adding a new chapter, 492, about low-powered vehicles, which does basically four things. Codifies the low-powered vehicle, providing flexibility on the specific type, which I just mentioned about foot scooters. It defines foot scooters as specific in accordance with state statute, and requires an agreement for motorized foot scooter sharing operations in city-controlled right-of-way, and defines, lastly, how personal and shared motor foot scooters will be regulated. So with that, Mr. Chair, those are my comments, and I welcome any questions or comments.
Are there any questions per the staff presentation? See none. Oh, Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. It seems that we are starting to see some scooters in our city, and these regulations won't be in place until the council adopts them, you know, assuming it passes through the committee today, through the council process in a couple of weeks, signed by the mayor. Can you offer us some perspective on, so this would require operators to have a license from the city. So I just wondered if have any companies approached us to ask for information about obtaining a license, or for information about how they might be able to operate in our city yet?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, yes, we've been approached. We also know that the University of Minnesota has been approached. Specifically, we do have some future conversations later this week about that with at least one vendor. So we're expecting more conversations with them to proceed towards these license agreements accordingly.
Thank you. And I can maybe let the public hearing take place and then say anything else after that. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, if there are no other questions per the presentation, I will open the public hearing on this item, item 3, low power vehicle ordinance. Anyone sign in? No one has signed in. Anyone wish to come forward and give comment or testimony? Anyone wish to come forward? Seeing no takers, I will close the public hearing and just extend upon what Council President Bender has alluded to, and certainly was clearly in my mind articulated by the presentation by Mr. Wirches, is that we are inviting new modality. We anticipate different modal options, and we want to make sure that they comport with the right-of-way livability issues that we've done with every other mode, to make sure that we're conscious of how they interact with our pedestrians and other vulnerable people on the streets, and so to make sure that we have a really good system in place. I should note that even though we are moving forward through our normal process, and that has, a time component to it, as Council President Bender alluded to, we still have a council hearing and approval, signature by the mayor. Make it very clear, and I'll highlight a point that was touched upon. We do have a significant amount of regulative elements on the books now to do what we need to do to make sure that our right-of-way is usable for all modal types. And so I just want to make that very, very clear. We're not sort of in absence of a regulatory framework. We have a regulatory framework. What we're endeavoring to do now is to have clarity that's specific to a mode, only to better benefit that mode and the operators that anticipate operating. It really is a welcoming, help not hinder sort of gesture that we're trying to do. And I guess I appeal to those operators, work with our staff, be a part of that solution. So the final product is something that you recognize as a way to success for what you're trying to do and what our citizens need as well. I'll leave it to Director Hutchinson if you have any details.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, we have current regulations that we rely upon from the state that are enforceable today. And those govern how the low-powered vehicles operate within the right-of-way, such as where within the right-of-way they can operate and how fast. We also have some regulations that are enforceable today from the city, including it is illegal to obstruct the public right-of-way and illegal to offer or sell goods from the city sidewalks. So we do have some very reasonable approaches that are in place today as we are taking these next 2 weeks to adopt a more refined ordinance that will require the license agreement that helps us to regulate how low-powered vehicles are parked and arranged within our right-of-way. So we feel, again, just to echo what you and other council members have said, very supportive of the new mobility options that provide choice and confident that we can work together with companies that wish to do business here with both the rules that we have in place as well as those that are proposed here today.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a couple of questions. I was going to wait till after public hearing. I assumed some people would be here to speak to this. But and one of my questions is I know with dockless bike share, one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that that we gave an exclusive so that there weren't competing companies sort of creating a proliferation of bikes that was sort of in excess of what we needed and for the sake of competition. Does this allow us to make that kind of a deal, and do we have an intention to make that kind of a deal?
Good question. Director Orchis.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Fletcher, a lot of similarities, but a little differences between bike share and potentially scooter share. We had an agreement with bike share before. We don't have current agreements with scooter share. So our choices of how we want to approach it, singularly, multiple vendors, RFP process, all of those things are at our disposal on how we want to proceed forward with scooters.
And do you need guidance from us on that approach, or do you feel like you have a plan?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Fletcher, we at this point would like to be able to continue to consider our options. By having a license agreement, we can work in partnership with companies to operate in the right-of-way, but we're not foregoing our future conversations about whether we would like to pursue an exclusive arrangement or not. So I think you can anticipate hearing more from us on that topic.
Okay, great. Thank you. I do have one more question. Sorry. And then I guess I want to make sure that in looking at the structure of fines and in looking at some of the ways that the ordinance is written, something has to be parked in the right of way for 15 minutes. So does that mean that if we see it, we have to wait 15 minutes and come circle back to it? Are we creating something that's a little bit burdensome from a regulatory perspective? And I think the reason I want to ask that question is that there are two kinds of disruption in new tech companies, right? There's really great disruption where they bring us a new service, where they come up with a new way to do a thing, where they make something possible that wasn't possible before. And then there's a kind of disruption where they look at a thing and they say, what if we could do that thing without creating living wage jobs, if we could externalize the costs of labor to other sources? And I feel like looking at the scooter models and the sort of, the sort of bounty hunter model for charging and some of the stuff that we're starting to see, it feels like there's a bit of both, an element of both in this business model. And so as we look at the way some of this is rolling out, I want to make sure that we're excited about the thing that's new. And I'm like, I'll use scooters if they're there. I think they're cool. But also being careful that we're not letting companies come in and externalize the cost of regulation and externalize the cost of keeping these things out of the right of way as they try to build a business model that has as few living wage jobs as possible. And so I want to make sure that we have a fine structure that's defined that we can actually enforce. I want to make sure that we're not doing something that's overly burdensome to traffic control and regulatory services. I want to make sure that whatever role the city takes on in being part of this scooter ecosystem sort of pays for itself in the process. So do you feel like the ordinance creates enough of a structure for us to generate fees that pay for the additional work that we're taking on?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Fletcher, a lot of questions there. Similar questions that the team has thought of in that regards. And I think we think the ordinance kind of lays out that framework that we're intending to use. And so as we get into the parameters and the details of these agreements, those are exactly some of the elements that we want to, flesh out and better define. It is not our intention to absorb the cost of this on the public side of the equation. And so what would be the fair and proper way to ensure compliance? And we are engaging like we have with our partners on TNC as well as with bike share, that there are unique provisions to each one of those kind of elements, and we'll have to find the right massaging for scooters.
Thank you. Thank you. And then just touching on a couple points in terms of keeping our options open, even with our bike share arrangement, it has a time limit. We're going to learn, and even at that terminus point, we'll look and evaluate. And in that instance, we've also kept our options open too, because the ordinance doesn't say thou shalt only have exclusive. It allows for that, and we've created a parameter in the pilot term, but it doesn't say we are committed to that permanently. That's the beauty of having a pithy, sort of concise ordinance. And so I would say that similarly, we have our options here, but we do have to have a pithy anchor to hang our hat on from a regulatory perspective. In addition, our car share, unlike the bike, we had multiple operators and still do have multiple operators, and some have come and gone. So we've done it both ways, and I think we have a good regulatory framework in all instances, and I think we just want to refine for the benefit of this mode, not to the detriment or the hindrance of it, but for the betterment of its operation to comport with our, I think, really well-run system of regulation. And I thank you, Councilmember Fletcher, for bringing up some of the key points. Sometimes it's just, do we do it or not? But the how is the key. And I think you really highlighted a lot of those points. So well done. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I want to echo what the chair indicated, which is, I think, for the most part, the city of Minneapolis wants to have a collaborative and not an oppositional relationship with new companies that are coming to offer transportation options in our city. And I hope we don't have to go down the road of taking a more oppositional approach. So I hope that the companies that are coming take the chair's advice and approach staff or council members about how they can work together with us on our new regulations and hopefully come into compliance with the new requirement that they have a license to operate in our city. I also take to heart Councilmember Fletcher's point about the labor implications of new technology. And I think it's worth having perhaps folks from civil rights or others who are involved in our worker protection conversations take a look at this model of employment and what workplace regulations that we have in place might apply or not, and how we could potentially strengthen those to apply here. Of course, we have our local minimum wage law and wage theft ordinances, but depending on how employment contracts are structured, it would be helpful for us to understand how that happens within these companies and what applies and what doesn't. And this isn't the only industry where our workplace regulations you know, may or may not apply. So I think that's a broad statement, not specific to this particular industry, but since they're coming now, it's timely for us to get on top of that as well. So those are my 2 comments. And I really appreciate staff's proactive work in having this ready for today and making sure that we are, you know, staying up with the technologies that are coming and welcoming innovation in our city, welcoming transportation options, particularly those that have lower impact on our environment. I think as far as I'm concerned, as long as these scooters are not impeding pedestrians and folks are able to operate them safely, I think they're a welcome addition to our transportation system. So I'm excited to work together with these companies to make sure that they're, you know, that we're all on the same page about how operations will go forward. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Any other comments before we make a motion to move? Seeing none, well, I'll just put a fine point on it. As Council President Bender said, you know, the open invitation to collaborate with the city as we formate our whatever our ordinances are, whatever our regulatory framework is kind of a hallmark of how we do business. I mean, it's from beginning to end and throughout the process. It's always iterative, and the table is always open to all parties because we want that information. It makes a better ordinance. So I think we're pretty sincere and consistent on that. And then to be welcome in a city like this, I mean, this is just any place. Our right of way for all modes is pretty spectacular by comparison. So to be a part of that, it didn't happen by accident, and it won't be an accidental happenstance approach that will continue it. So be a part of a good system in Minneapolis is our big invite. And of course, there's a sort of subtext to why we keep saying that, because there might be an early launch pending, but I won't go into that. It's not for this format. With that, I will move the item before us and thank staff for the expeditious work. Any further conversation? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries. We can now go to the discussion part of our agenda, starting with item 13, Hennepin Avenue, street reconstruction, project layout, easement, and request for variance. Director Hutchinson, big update.
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I am so pleased to highlight the work of an interdisciplinary team that has been working for the last year to refine the design on Hennepin Avenue downtown. I would like to take an opportunity to recognize a collaborative approach between transportation engineering and design led by Don Elwood and Simon Blensky from Transportation Planning and Programming, who have really come together to run an excellent process, inclusive process that is resulting in the information you're about to hear. We're very excited to present on this layout for Hennepin Avenue downtown, and Simon Blensky is going to walk you through it now.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Simon Blensky, transportation planner with Public Works in our Transportation Planning and Programming Division. Here today to provide an update on the Hennepin Avenue project. We also have 3 related actions for the project as well. Seeking approval for the layout, passing a resolution directing the city engineer to proceed with the state aid variance request, and lastly, authorizing Public Works to negotiate with property owners for easements and right-of-way. We'll cover each of those items in a moment, but first we wanted to give you some background on the project and what we've been up to over the past couple of years. The project itself is a redesign and reconstruction of Hennepin Avenue through downtown. The limits are between Washington Avenue and 12th Street. Public Works also made an effort to look beyond the limits of the reconstruction project to the whole Hennepin Avenue corridor between the river and the sculpture garden. The goal there was to create a public realm vision for the whole corridor in order to better inform what sort of enhancements and public realm elements we might include with the reconstruction project itself. The project is needed because the street is old. It was last reconstructed 30 years ago in 1986. Infrastructure both above ground and below ground is worn out, and it definitely needs to be updated. It's also an opportunity to make it more relevant to people who are using it today. The street currently doesn't meet all the needs of the users that are using it today, people walking, biking, and taking transit. With the project, Public Works convened a stakeholder advisory committee to help guide work around the project. The Stakeholder Advisory Committee included representation from Hennepin Theater Trust, the Building Owners and Managers Association, Downtown Council and DID, the Downtown Minneapolis Neighborhood Association, and also Metro Transit. Working with that Stakeholder Advisory Committee, we came up with project principles to help guide the design. That included a safe and accessible design, a design and project that's durable and cost effective, especially with respect to enhancements for the corridor. We know that Hennepin Avenue also changes a lot from day to night, from weekday to weekend, and we want to make sure that space that we're designing is dynamic and flexible. We know Hennepin Avenue is also a great destination, and we want to make sure the design is also a great public place. And then we want to make it relevant for people today, but also look forward to all the systems changes that are coming to our transportation network and ensuring that the design remains flexible going forward. Thousands of people use Hennepin Avenue every day, and those people are moving by a variety of different modes. There's thousands of people walking, biking, waiting for the bus, and driving along Hennepin Avenue. And Hennepin Avenue is actually unique when you look at our downtown network in that it's not a specialized street like maybe some of our other corridors like Nicollet Mall or Marquette and 2nd, which are really focused on specific modes. Hennepin Avenue really has it all. It's how people are using it today. It's what our planning guidance calls for, and it's what we're designing for. Regarding the project budget, just a quick update here. Public Works currently has a capital budget request for $23 million for the project. This covers the base street project and base streetscape. It's comprised of a combination of city, state, and federal funding sources. Enhancements are not currently determined or funded yet, but there may be interest in that. We've had some conversations with stakeholders and property owners along the corridor. Elements like enhanced streetscape would need to be funded by adjacent property owners. Other activation and arts elements would require additional funding sources. Again, we've had some conversations to date, but we're going to continue those going through 2018 and into 2019. No actions regarding that today. We've been doing a lot of work over the past couple of years since 2016 with this project. We've been talking with a lot of people and listening to a lot of people that use Hennepin Avenue. I mentioned we've convened a stakeholder advisory committee to help guide engagement and connect us with the right people along Hennepin Avenue. And we've also had many opportunities to connect with people along the corridor. We've had many open houses, design workshops. We've had many opportunities to connect with people one-on-one to talk about specific issues. We've also been out on the street, setting up shop at bus stops during rush hour to make sure we're connecting and informing people about the project who are actually using the street. This is just a snapshot of who we've talked to today and are going to continue to talk with going forward. On a street like Hennepin, we feel it's very important to connect with as many people as we can. We're bringing forward a project layout today, and we want to note that that layout is consistent with a concept that was developed for the corridor in 2016. That concept was approved by City Council and used to help support an application for federal funding, which we've since been awarded. That took place in 2016. Since then, we've really applied that typical block concept to the full 10 blocks of the corridor. And what was included in that concept is wide sidewalks, protected bikeway in each direction, accommodating bus stops and transit along the corridor, and typically 4 vehicle lanes along the corridor with left turn lanes at 2 specific locations. Knowing a few highlights of the layout itself in terms of dimensions, we're at a point where we are able to share more detail. Overall, we wanted to highlight that really the space behind the curb is increasing along the corridor with this project. We're able to achieve consistently 10-foot wide through sidewalk areas along the project limits. Typically a 10 to 11-foot wide furnishing zone. So this is where things like lights, trees, potential streetscape, bus stops would go. In some locations, it might actually just be an open area in front of a theater or high demand pedestrian area. We also are including the protected bikeway, which is separate from the roadway at sidewalk elevation. The best example of this we have now is the recent reconstruction on Washington Avenue. The roadway itself is narrowing from typically 58 feet to 46 feet. This is reducing the crossing distance for people walking across Hennepin. We're also shortening crossing distances on most cross streets with utilizing curb extensions at those locations. We've also worked very closely with Metro Transit along the way with this project. They've been a great partner. We've been able to actually consolidate bus stops along the corridor from 13 to 8. There's actually several locations along the corridor where a bus is stopping every block. We feel that this is better for the overall operations of transit, better for the overall project as well in terms of kind of decluttering some of the pedestrian spaces along the corridor. One of the actions that I noted is related to a state aid variance request. We're seeking a variance for 3 items. First, for the width of the bikeway, we will need to go a little bit narrower at bus stops. So we're recommending a 6-foot bike lane in lieu of 7-foot at some locations. We're also recommending a slightly lower bikeway design speed at the transit stops as well. And then the third variance request is related to the vehicle lane widths themselves. We're recommending 10-foot lanes in lieu of 11-foot lanes for the 2 inside vehicle lanes. Another action before you today is related to right-of-way. Public Works is recommending right-of-way acquisition on Hennepin Avenue between the blocks of 10th Street and 11th Street. And the reason for this is that this block is simply more constrained than the rest of the other 10 blocks. Typically, we have about 100 feet of right-of-way to work with on other blocks. On this block, we're about 12 to 16 feet narrower. Additional right-of-way actually on this block benefits not just this block, but actually a 3-block stretch between 9th and 12th. We're able to actually consolidate a number of bus stops along this segment and accommodate them between 10th and 11th. This greatly improves safety and operations along the corridor by having less bus stops. And it also simply just provides space for all modes. Without right-of-way, we would be very constrained and have constrained dimensions for all modes. And I will note too that the action today really starts the process for this, allows Public Works to begin negotiations for the right-of-way. Just walking through the layout in a couple segments at a high level, starting on the north end. This graphic, starting from the building face, the white area is the through pedestrian zone, the tan area is the furnishing zone, the gray is the protected bikeway, and then the roadway configuration itself. We're showing the 2 left turn lanes at 3rd Street and Washington. And on this section, we're including bus stops, maintaining bus stops between 3rd and 4th Streets in front and across from the library. Between 5th to 8th, the typical configuration continues. To note on this segment, we're maintaining bus stops at 5th Street to provide a direct connection to the light rail. And then also between the blocks of 7th and 8th Street, again to provide transfers to those main east-west bus routes through downtown. And further south between 8th and 12th, we have a couple blocks that I would say are very kind of clean and decluttered between 8th and 9th and 9th and 10th in front of some of our major theaters. Between 10th and 11th, that's where we're recommending the right-of-way acquisition. And then our project continues through the intersection of 12th Street. We've been doing a lot of work over the past few years, and we have several more years of work to go on this project still, but we really wanted to just check in today at this milestone. We have, looking forward to some next steps. We have a lot of detailed design work to come before us. One thing to note too, we've been working very closely with our advisory committees, the BAC, PAC, Committee on People with Disabilities. One issue they're very interested in is the design details of bus stops along the corridor. And we're going to continue to work with them through a series of some joint workshops. So more details on that to come. We're also going to be continuing to talk about enhancements along the corridor, working with property owners to determine more specifically what those enhancements should be and what the funding levels are going to be. The images on the screen here are really a summary of the feedback we've heard to date and sort of the character and elements that we may be including as part of enhancements, but more work to be done through 2018 and into 2019. We are also going to be starting to look forward at construction and evaluating construction staging with consideration for all the downtown work that's happening around this time as well. We do know that work will begin sometime in 2019. And lastly, through design and through construction, we're going to continue to be talking with everyone that uses Hennepin, continuing to engage folks about the project. That concludes my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions per the presentation? Councilmember Gordon, followed by Council President Bender.
Thank you, and I appreciate the presentation. I guess I just wanted to ask a little bit about the intersections and the bus stops. Something I've noticed on the protected bikeway on Washington Avenue is that the bikers do a lot of swerving around, and sometimes it's just easier to go right in the street, especially if you're commuting through that area and you just want to get to North Minneapolis. Getting on the protected bikeway starts to feel like there's so much slowing down and negotiating. So I don't quite understand why we just don't allow the protected bikeway to stay out in the roadway and have the buses pull in and out. I mean, I guess I understand. What I'm curious about is there any data? Is there any information about what's actually safer or isn't safe? And is there any truth to my idea and personal practice sometimes where I just say, I'm just going to ride in the street now so I can actually, get to where I'm going faster than using this protected bikeway? Because it would be a waste to have the protected bikeway and have bikers end up going in the street, but it would also be a fatal mistake to not keep the bikes closer to the sidewalk and the pedestrians if it meant they would be hurt by the buses. So do we have data on where it works and how it works in other places, and any expert opinions, or how did we land on what we have proposed here, which is more of the swerving around the buses?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, the recommendation to have the bikeway bend behind the transit stops is an idea that emerged when we were working on the project in 2016. We've done research on that design since. We're going to continue to be looking at it going forward, but the concept itself is really a best practice that's being used in a lot of our peer cities, and it's being used successfully. We want to make sure, though, that whatever design we use here is fits within the context of Hennepin and all of the mix of users that use Hennepin. So we're going to be kind of trying to pull together and look to our peer cities and different installations and try and kind of put something together that can be successful. We definitely want to continue working with our advisory committees, because we've actually heard some feedback from those committees about the design of Washington Avenue, and we're thinking about some lessons learned there about the different bikeway design elements as it bends, as it approaches intersections. I think there's some things we may think about differently on Hennepin Avenue.
Well, that would be good to look at what's happening in Washington, I think, too. And even if I know if it's a raised curb protected bikeway, it would have to go lower if it's going to stay in the street. But that would also avoid potential conflicts with pedestrians who are boarding buses and getting on that. And I don't really know if the professional bus drivers are going to be, it seems like negotiating that's a normal thing that often happens, because bike paths are often on the other side and they're going to be crossing over, and we have ways of marking that so everybody understands, oh, this is a potential conflict zone. It's striped differently. But I wish there was more science. I wish there was more data and information we could go on to make sure it's the right choice. And I'm glad you're going to continue looking at it and doing research, and you're looking at Washington and what's working and isn't.
Thank you. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'm thrilled to support a layout that has wider sidewalks and a protected curb-separated bike lane on this critical corridor downtown. And I think staff did such a good job of balancing all the needs and demands of this constrained corridor in the heart of downtown. My question won't surprise you, but I want to ask if you considered bus prioritization beyond what we see here in front of us, like a bus priority lane or signal timing advantages for buses, and how that might be incorporated into this section of roadway.
What we have before you today in terms of the layout is really, sorry, Mr. Chair, Council President Bender, what we have before you today is really a layout that is very two-dimensional and really is establishing where the curb lines are going to be. There are really a host of operational things that we're going to have to consider going forward. We've definitely heard from some stakeholders about transit operations along the corridor. We're going to continue working with Metro Transit on this going forward. One thing to note is that we're anticipating some benefit for transit operations along the corridor in terms of the consolidation of bus stops. Going from 13 down to 8 and not having to stop every block, that provides some advantage already, both for people using transit, but also everyone else using the street as well. So still more work to come, but we think the layout has accounted for some of that already, or has thought about transit priority a little bit already.
And I'll just add, Councilmember Reich and I got the chance to ride on the trial, the really brief 3-day trial of the bus-only lane on the section of Hennepin Avenue that's farther south from here in wards 10 and 7 in the Uptown area. And anecdotally from my constituents, they were really thrilled with the results of that relatively small tweaks only during peak period operations in just certain segments of that few block stretch. And so I think that taught us that the way that you are working with Metro Transit staff to look for those opportunities to prioritize transit, I think will really show us a lot of benefit in the future. So I really appreciate the way that this design is more flexible going forward into the future to allow for hopefully more transit prioritization and other kind of flexibility as our transportation shifts that maybe wouldn't be available with a more constrained roadway. So absent that, I might be saying, why is the road so wide here? But I think given the transit operations and the future potential benefits of this more flexible layout, I think that this is I really appreciate this approach, and I support the staff's recommendation for that. I also just wanted to say, I know that a number of us have been in touch with the Hennepin Theater Trust, and they have been really important partners in being proactive in activating the roadway and looking at public realm improvements. And I know that staff has been working together with them as a full partner in the design, and that as we go forward into those more design details, I know that staff is committed, and the council is as well, to working with partners like the Hennepin Theater Trust and others to activate this roadway to make it a really special place. Right now, it has so many amazing destinations and uses along the corridor, but the roadway doesn't really support that in the way that I think it will in the future. So it's exciting to think about the way that those design elements and those partnerships can create a real benefit for all of the institutions and arts destinations along this corridor. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to shout out the incredible community outreach work that has happened on this project. I've had a chance to go to several of the workshop meetings and planning meetings around this, where we took in a lot of ideas, and people had a lot of energy around this because this street is so special. There is so much going on here. It is such an important center of our economic activity and our cultural activity and our entertainment district and everything else that's going on. So I'm really excited about it. And it's really important, I think, that we all be thinking creatively moving forward. One of the things I really like about this layout is it feels like it's going to make things move really smoothly, and it leaves this furnishing space where we can really be thinking about then how do we make this feel creative and special, right? There's sort of a next step in this, which is not just how do we make it work, but then how do we make it feel as important as it is to our city. And I think, I know that work is happening, and I appreciate that. And I know that a lot of community feedback was gathered about both of this layout that we're approving today that I'm happy to vote for, and also about some of the more creative elements that we want to see come into this in the long term. So thank you for your work on this. Look forward to continuing to work with you, and I'm looking forward to this being a really important center of our city.
Any other comments from the committee? Seeing none, I appreciate all the highlighted comments from my colleagues, and I'll just echo that this has been no small endeavor. When you said Hennepin Avenue has it all, boy, that's the statement right there. And to try to mix all that modality, but the level of modality, it's not just as multimodal, but it's intensely multimodal. I think Councilmember Fletcher sums it up. This is a very special street. Nicollet, of course, is always going to be the darling of the design magazines, and the elements are such a key thing. And what does the trash can look like every 2 decades is a big deal. But here, the star of the show of Hennepin Avenue has always been the people. This is a people street. This is a main drag. It's where the action is. And to accommodate that looking forward, I think is a big step. Here we have a physical layout, a very complicated physical layout, given all the challenges. But the whole way, with all the participation that Councilmember Fletcher pointed out, was always forward-looking. It's not just going to be the concrete. It's going to be the people on that concrete and how it interfaces. And so we have a very forward-looking design that grounds us into some real-world decisions that have to be made. And I'm very happy to support what we have before us, knowing how well you and staff and the community has looked forward to activating this very, very dynamic, very incredible urban corridor. With that, I will move approval. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting nay. We move the layout before us. Thank you. And we now can go to our final item, which is discussion item 14, Minneapolis 2040. Director Hutchinson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, we are happy to be working in partnership with our friends and colleagues in community planning and economic development. We're pleased to be joined by Heather Worthington, the Director of Long Range Planning, who will present on the Minneapolis 2040 plan and receive and file.
Good morning, Director Hutchinson. Or
Morning.
Director Worthington, sorry.
Good morning, Chair Reich, council members. I just want to do a little intro, and then I'm going to ask Paul Mogish to come up. Many of you have heard our spiel about the comp plan already. We've had about 150 staff members from around the enterprise working on this plan since 2016, and in a variety of ways, through research committees, through input to a draft that we released on March 22nd. And our colleagues in Public Works have been immensely helpful in this process, and many of them are in the room today who have participated with our staff in developing the draft, which we, as I said, released on March 22nd. We're closing in on the end of the comment period, so we wanted to come around and talk with council committees about how the comp plan draft relates to the work that you do. You will see that this draft has a small number of what we're calling land use policies that would be considered regulatory in terms of the statute requiring the comp plan. But then there are a number of other statements, we're thinking of them as policy statements at this point, that relate to the land use policies that we've laid out and are really interconnected with those land use policies. And I like to talk about this as a four-legged stool. The overarching or the top of the stool is really the environment or climate action plan that the city adopted in 2005. But the legs of that stool are housing, employment, workforce, and children. So thinking about the interrelatedness of those issues and how we think about the city in terms of land use and transportation. And so I'd like to ask Paul to come up and do a little bit more of a deeper dive with you today around those issues as they relate to the draft, and we'll stand for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Paul Mogish. I work in the Long Range Planning Division of CPED. As Heather laid out, the core of the draft comprehensive plan is actually a very small number of policies. There are only 4 land use policies that lay the groundwork for the draft maps that are in the comprehensive plan that guide the growth and development of the city between now and 2040. And a number of other policies that support those land use policies and show how everything is interrelated. And transportation is one of the most important among those. And this draft plan continues a long-standing tradition of coordinating land use and transportation planning in Minneapolis. For a long time, the city has directed new growth, residential and employment growth to places that are most accessible by transit. For example, this plan, of course, carries that forward. And in the inverse, the transportation planning that's happened has been supportive of land use change and the growth of the city over time. So, for example, the Access Minneapolis Transportation Plan uses the land use map of the current comprehensive plan as one of the foundations for transportation planning, the design of streets and sidewalks, and so on. So on the land use side of things, as I mentioned, there are 4 land use policies, and they are focused on providing access to housing, employment, and commercial goods as a means to achieving the 14 goals for the comprehensive plan adopted by the City Council. So it's not land use planning for the sake of planning, it's planning for the sake of achieving, working towards achieving goals. And so the first, there are 4 of them. Here are 3 of them as an example. Access to housing. This plan carries forward, as I mentioned, the idea of focusing growth along transit lines, so allowing multifamily housing on public transit routes with higher densities along high-frequency routes and near metro stations. Metro is the branding that Metro Transit uses for the LRT lines and highway bus rapid transit. Access to commercial goods and services. This is something that's a little bit new in this plan draft from what we've done in the past in comprehensive plans. Something that we've learned through looking at data and research is that Minneapolis residents are spending a lot of money on retail goods and services outside the boundaries of the city, which means that they're getting in cars to go to other parts of the metro to do their shopping. And so we see an opportunity, both from a livability standpoint and a transportation standpoint and a climate change standpoint, to reduce some of those car trips by providing more opportunities for folks to do that shopping within the city limits, closer to home, in places that are accessible by transit. So what this policy is saying is that when you look at the draft land use map and look closely, you'll see additional areas that are guided for commercial use in the future to make it easier for retailers and other service providers to locate in the city and reduce car trips. And then finally, access to employment is, of course, very important. One sample policy among many in the draft comprehensive plan related to employment and land use and transportation is to develop minimum development densities for downtown to make sure that we're reinforcing downtown as the employment center of the region and the upper Midwest, and reinforcing the transit accessibility of our downtown. There are several transportation-related policies in the draft plan that help support all of this, and we've provided just a sampling here of those. There's a transit policy, and one of the action steps in that draft policy is to actively shape and define the city's transit vision and operations framework with a focus on outcomes rather than modes. So among those outcomes would be all of these access policies from land use, making sure that our transit system serves the needs of our residents in providing access to housing, jobs, and commercial goods. Other outcomes would be, of course, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving equity with access to employment. There's a policy on walking, which reaffirms existing city policy on pedestrian access, improving the pedestrian environment in order to encourage walking as a mode of transportation. And the draft plan reaffirms the recently adopted Complete Streets policy. There's a sample action step here: incorporate the Complete Streets policy into all elements of the public right-of-way, including landscaping, transit shelters, lighting, signs, traffic lights, parking meters, bike parking, and furniture. That's just a sampling of the many transportation policies. A couple more that are more about proactive coordination on the implementation of these policies. So coordinating on development and transportation. For example, this policy 80 on development near metro stations. Something that we know is that many of our existing and planned light rail transit stations in Minneapolis are in former or existing freight rail corridors, or along highways. And those circumstances create a special need to coordinate very closely with our colleagues in Public Works and with other agencies on making sure that those station platforms are accessible by walking and biking, and to make sure that the station areas have the street infrastructure that they need to support new development. So that's what that policy is about. We also know that transit accessible areas are great places for building affordable housing because having access to public transportation is an important part of the affordability equation for a household. So there's a policy that supports focusing those efforts on transit station areas. So that was intended just to provide a quick look at what is a lot of information in the draft comprehensive plan as it relates to transportation and land use, to hopefully start a discussion here in this room over the next few minutes. A brief overview of what's next. As Heather mentioned, the comment period, which began in March, continues through July 22nd. By late September, we will have an updated draft of the plan based on the feedback that we've already been receiving and that we will continue to receive through July 22nd. In late October, there will be a public hearing at the City Planning Commission for that group's consideration of the draft plan, the revised draft, with council action expected in December. And with that, I'll leave it to questions.
Any questions per the presentation? Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So our city actually does very well nationally when you look at how jobs and people housing are served by transit. But I know from my own experience as a frequent transit rider and my constituents, many of whom depend on transit, that we have a lot of room for improvement. So I wondered if folks from CPED or Public Works could talk about how this will include or incorporate those kind of transportation elements that we talked about at the Public Works study session, the work that's happening on collecting data about our transit system and how we might see recommendations coming forward in the future about how the city can work together with Metro Transit or even on our own to invest in those high frequency transit routes that so many of our transit dependent populations depend on, and where the draft plan, at least in its current draft form, is proposing we continue to build on focusing jobs and housing destinations near transit.
I just have a few brief thoughts, and then I'd like to ask Robin to talk about how we plan to integrate the Access Minneapolis work. I would just generally say that the Metropolitan Council typically and consistently points to land use as one of the prime drivers of their investments in high frequency transit lines, whether those are fixed rail investments or buses. And so one of the things that I think we could do a much better job around is really being very clear about that nexus between land use and transportation investments, in particular transit investments. That's just a general comment. I think you just said that, so I would agree.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, I agree with so many of the principles that are proposed in the draft comprehensive plan because they are so transit supportive and many elements of transit supportive, not just what a network looks like and how it functions, but what are the building blocks that lead to high transit ridership. We are going to key off of the broad policy statements that are made in the 2040 plan to further develop recommendations for any updates to our frequent transit network that are already proposed in Access Minneapolis, as well as more detail on how transit should operate for us in the city of Minneapolis within specific work in the Access Minneapolis update, which that may be the last time we say Access Minneapolis, because we have news coming from what we're going to call it. But it is a 10-year action plan. It will be very specific, and it will have a chapter devoted to transit.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good highlight for the public to know that here we have a broad framework that interfaces with different elements that correlate. So built environment transportation gets addressed here. And then we can zero in on the transportation element if we've gotten that sort of framework done correctly. And of course, we have more work to do as we get to the final draft. But then the detail work really kicks in. But it's so important to have the right context to set that up, because the details would be meaningless without that guidance. And I do, whoever said the phrase, transit supportive elements throughout, not just the transit areas, but the areas that might have another category, have seemed to be very mindful of how they play into the transit element. And I think that will be one of the key sort of characteristics of this comp plan versus others, is just how intertwined and how highlighted that is. I know other elements have made their way to the news cycle, but to me, this is actually more of a defining feature than any of the other elements by comparison to other comp plans, be it our own or other municipalities. Sitting here with my colleagues at this particular committee, we're keenly interested in that, and I think we're appreciative of that aspect of it. And it all should be noted, this isn't happening in isolation. Director Hutchinson, you've been part of and parcel of all the committee work that got to this point, and I think you've been advising throughout the process.
Mr. Chair, you have said it well. We work extremely collaboratively with CPED. We have to. We enjoy it. We were very much at the table for the development of the, especially transportation policies, but also some other public works related items such as stormwater management or drinking water or air quality. And we have incorporated staff from CPED into the development of our transportation action plan. We know we need to do this together, and I think our staffs are very close, working very closely.
I would only add that so much of a comp plan really is a systems statement. And so Public Works has most of those systems within their bailiwick. So we need to work very closely with our colleagues, but we also value their expertise and very much enjoy that interaction.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate the opportunity to look at the transportation elements of the plan, because some other elements of the plan have been the most discussed things. And often when we're talking about housing and we talk about density, it often gets talked about as though there's no benefit to density, as though people only think about what they think might be burdensome about it. And actually, I think a lot of the transit vision, a lot of what this drives home, is actually all the ways that it's actually very beneficial to have sufficient density, that you can have some of the community amenities that make it possible to have more walkable neighborhoods. So we're getting grocery stores in the places where we've added enough people for there to be a market for a grocery store. It's very exciting. And then we can have neighborhoods where we can have more self-contained communities where you don't have to travel all over the city for all of your errands. And the quality of life for everybody in the neighborhood goes up when we have those things. And so I think really thinking about how do we make this a transit and pedestrian friendly environment where it's easy to get places. I mean, we're obviously not going to run buses through neighborhoods where only 2 people are going to get on them, right? I mean, we need enough people to ride the buses to justify the expense, and all those things are so interconnected. So I'm really excited about this transit vision. I think a lot of people are excited about this transit vision. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on the transportation portion of the comp plan, and I think it's worth noting that those things are interconnected, that we can't just do the transportation part and not also do some of the land use changes that are proposed. Thank you for this. It's really nice to get to focus on the transportation piece of this in particular.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher. I would just add, I think this is a really important part of the discussion, is sort of the economics of the land use decisions that we make as a city and how they drive other investments and how they provide a return on those investments. So having a deeper discussion with our community about the value of those investments, I think is really an important part of this discussion. Thank you for highlighting that.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did want to highlight that I've gotten some comments, and I look forward to seeing the full array of comments that we're getting from all of our constituents. But one thing that I've heard so far is that we did a really good job, staff and council, of highlighting our city's history of race and equity, and that we probably have a little ways to go in incorporating race equity commitments into the future policy statements in our plan. And I think this is one area where we can look to strengthen the language in the draft plan for the final document, and I want to work with staff on that and our colleagues. I think back to the point about transit, I think we could make some commitments about prioritizing city investments in racially concentrated areas of poverty. I think we're moving away from using that term, but the Metropolitan Council is using that term. I know it's in line with Public Works existing direction and how they're using resources and focusing resources. So I think Public Works staff would likely have some ideas about how to really reflect the direction that we've already been going in the final proposal that would come to council. So I just wanted to say, again, kind of the high level is that I think the transportation policy statements is a place where we could strengthen our commitment to race equity in line with what we've already been doing as a city and how we can strengthen that going forward. I also wanted to, just since Councilmember Fletcher brought it up, I think something that's getting a bit lost in some of the language and discussion around the draft plan is, number one, we have to have a draft plan. 2040 is a year in the future, which is coming, and our city is growing, and we're required to have a plan. So there's no such thing as no plan. And so, our job as council members is to work together to hopefully come to consensus on the best way to shape that growth in line with the commitments that we made last term and together going forward to make sure that our local decisions are not exacerbating climate change, that we are addressing race inequity and creating a future that has more equity for all in our city. And those high-level goals that we all came together to support. I think that it's also important to remember that our city grew up around transit and that our neighborhoods by tradition and our history are walkable and integrated with multiple land uses, and that when you walk through basically any neighborhood, almost any neighborhood in our city, you see a variety of living situations, of housing options, of transportation options, and that diversity of choices is part of what makes our city really great. But we don't see it consistently across the city. And so that's where I think the direction of this plan is to create more options throughout the city so that we're not concentrating that in some neighborhoods and not in others. But by and large, our city grew up along streetcar lines. This is not a radical departure from our city's history. It is, in fact, a recommitment to the kind of sustainable growth that our city had in its very beginnings.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity and all the great policies and areas that the plan gets into having to do with transportation. I have a couple questions and I guess one comment to make about what maybe is not there. One thing I'm curious about is, does the plan offer anything for us to deal with the issue of streetcars or not streetcars and where? I noticed it's mentioned a couple times in the plan, but mostly looking back at how the city was formed. And I think it's an issue that we've certainly in the last 10 years talked about a lot and explored how we could do it and how we could provide some missing links with our own system. And it's a little bit absent in the draft I saw so far.
Thank you, Chair Wright, Councilmember Gordon. The plan is fairly high level, kind of a 50,000-foot view on that issue, but from a transactional sort of strategic and tactical standpoint, I believe that will be covered in Access Minneapolis. I'll let Robin speak to that a little bit.
And I'll note that's where it presently is housed, and so it will remain whatever the cool, fancy new name will be.
Whatever you call it.
Our 10-year Mr. Chair and Councilmember Gordon, our 10-year Transportation Action Plan, which will have yet a new shiny name at some point. We'll consider all modes of transit. As you know, we have an active study on Nicollet Modern. There have been at least 2 other corridors that have been identified. There is a map that is currently developed that you will see again and have a chance to discuss as we're developing that action plan.
I appreciate it. There still might be a little home for that to exist a little bit more clearly in the 2040 plan. I mean, so I'm never sure quite how much we want to make sure that our other plans get reflected in our comprehensive plan, but I think sometimes they're strengthened if they actually are, and some are definitely listed and given a high priority, like the Complete Streets policy, which clearly gets is designated as called out here, and we see, okay, part of our comp plan is going to be to implement this piece clearly. So I'll just put that out there. I'm also curious about if we can help figure out what to do with more of the right-of-way for other purposes. And I hear a lot of interest in people wondering, how could we use our right-of-way more for some kind of district uses? Stormwater management comes up a lot, but I also hear people talking about things as way out there as geothermal. Is there some way that we could actually use this to fight climate change and get more cooling or heating in by using the right of way? And is that in there at all, or how do we talk about that?
Chair Wright, Councilmember Gordon, I would suggest that that's probably in that category of more tactical things that we will continue to flesh out as we do additional policy work around the policy statements that are part of the comprehensive plan. And that could be part of an update of the climate action plan, for instance. So the way that our existing policy documents fit into the comprehensive plan is that we reference them. They're basically part of the comprehensive plan by reference. The fact that the Access Minneapolis plan is about 10 years old and it's being reworked indicates that it will come into the comp plan at some point as a reference document, but also as a document that helps to inform the policy making that you do as a body going forward, and some of the research that we do as staff to assist you in that endeavor. So that's a really good example, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because there are some things that are perhaps not as clear about the current policy setting that we're working in the comp plan. It doesn't always track perfectly with our other policy work. So that would be an example of something we could certainly look at.
Yeah, certainly district energy is called out in the climate action plan. And now the last thing that I want to bring up is something I'd like to see emphasized a lot more, and I actually think it connects back to issues about equity. And it's tied to transportation, but maybe a little bit tangentially. We do talk about the railroads, and we reference the interstates a couple times. But one of the things I think that happened in Minneapolis is we really suffered a major blow. The railroads certainly brought a lot to us, but we've also been recovering and recouping from a lot of abandoned railroad lines. And I mean, our whole downtown is thriving now in some sections that were once completely covered in rail yards. But we also had the interstate system come through our city. It tore it up. It tore up our housing. It isolated neighborhoods and it isolated communities. And now in other cities, you look at Dallas and even in Boston and other places, they're looking at, well, maybe there's actually some unutilized things. There's a greater purpose. We could figure out how to deal with these freeways and interstates. I would actually like to see a really clear policy that tees that up. I think that could be a really big idea for the next 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. It might actually be a way for us to find more space for housing, for density, for transit, for greenways, if we actually looked at these. And I know that the Urban Land Institute has done a little work around this. The Downtown Council has also looked at, is there a way to connect downtown to the university again? People have identified places where the freeway is already low enough so that we could put a lid over it. The state is even considering something in Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul. So I think it's a missed opportunity if we don't elevate this in our comp plan somehow and say this is going to be important enough for us to care about as we move forward after this plan's approved. And so I'm going to keep trying to, get people to care about that issue and bring it up as we go forward, because I think it is a great opportunity, and I want us to try to be able to take advantage of it, especially depending on how the winds blow in terms of the federal government and the state government. And I would say that might be a way that we could also help recover and get some repair from the damage that was done to people of color in our city and others as we move forward. Also think about connecting the north side back to the river, or for the first time ever to the river, by looking at how it's disconnected by 94 and how it goes through there as well. So thanks for letting me give that little speech, and it won't be the last time you'll hear something along those lines.
I believe you. Thank you for that, though. Any commentary on?
No, I would just point out that we had Urban 3 come in and do some data work for us, and we presented that to you several weeks ago. We've asked them to go back and look at, they did a kind of interesting graphic for us where they showed if we had the land that we lost in the freeway construction, what would that represent in terms of value to the city right now? It was substantial. So we've asked them now to go back and look a little deeper at that. And then we would like to take that and do more of an economic analysis around that to try and determine whether or not this idea of a lid or a deck would be financially feasible for the city going forward. But that's something we can certainly provide you with some more information on in the future.
Councilmember Gordon.
Excellent. Now I'm even fired up even more. And I think if you look at the history of it, in our population history, I think we definitely were able to house more people in the city years ago because more people lived in families and in housing. So that was one thing. But also where the population really took a dip was when the interstate came in and tore out all of that housing. And I think also facilitated the urban sprawl so easily so that people, that was a whole kind of national trend. But I think it's great that you're looking at those numbers and we start to think about if we actually recovered some of that land, how much housing could we provide or potentially employment and other amenities. So I look forward to hearing more.
Thank you. Any other questions or commentary? Seeing none. Well, thank you for engaging us at this particular juncture of the plan document, but also to highlight how it interfaces with the work that we more specifically do here and how it's not just an isolated element, but an integrated element that goes throughout. Thank you for highlighting that for the public.
Thank you.
Seeing no further conversation, I will move to receive and file the overview of the 2040 draft as it is submitted today. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting nay. That carries, and we are concluded with our agenda and thereby adjourned. Thank you.